Hi everybody, and welcome to CTV's post-election analysis show for the 2018 California general election. I'm Mayor Fred Gaines. I'm with Councilmember James Bozajian. This is our 22nd show doing analysis of Calabasas elections, and I wore my blue tie because we had a blue wave in this election in 2018.
And James. I had a red tie, but it got washed away by the blue wave, and now it's purple.
So let's get right to the numbers for our 2018 election analysis, and we'll start with, as we always like to do, just to show people where Calabasas is voter registration-wise compared to the state in our local area.
Well, Calabasas in the local area has historically been more Republican-leaning in the past, and as the state has become more Democratic, so has the area. Calabasas now and some of the surrounding cities actually have a plurality of Democrats. Not quite as much as the state, and the voting patterns are still a little bit more Republican than the state as a whole. But you've seen a slide off. If you just look at the incorporation figures for Calabasas, we had a plurality of Republicans when Calabasas incorporated, and now, and the Democratic registration stayed the same, but the Republican registration has dropped 21 points. There's now more decline to states and minor parties in Calabasas than there are Republicans. So it's really kind of a microcosm of the state.
You know, I like to say when you look at the map, as you move left, you go right. As you move across San Fernando Valley, to the left, to the west, you get slightly less Democratic, and then in Westlake Village you cross over to actually having Republicans in a slight plurality, and into Ventura County where you have Republicans in a plurality situation, although electing more and more Democrats in the last few years.
That's correct, and that pattern's held true, but you see a general slide in the whole area toward the Democrats. Not always in the voting results. Republicans still do carry Calabasas in some statewide races, depending on the year, not this year, but it's harder and harder, and the registration kind of speaks for itself. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we cover California issues.
And you might not think of Calabasas as a microcosm of the whole state, but when it comes to your registration numbers, it's almost exactly the same as the statewide registration numbers. 43% Democrat, we have 26% Republican, the state is 24% Republican. So you're really very, very close to a statewide match of the party registration.
Although not quite in the voting patterns. So we'll see a little bit later on. Let's talk about turnout. This was the highest turnout for a midterm election since 1982. I went back and assembled. It's 62% is the estimated turnout. We don't have the city number quite yet, but I think you projected it's going to be what?
About 2/3. So we're talking about our first ever city election combined with the state and national elections in November. And we had 2.5 to 3 times more people vote in a city election than we ever had before. Our typical city election, 3,000 or 4,000 voters. This year, over 10,000 voters in Calabasas voting in our city election. Of course, there's a drop-off from the top of the ballot to the very last page, which our city and school board election was on. Our incumbents were reelected. Congratulations to you and my other colleagues who were reelected. And this year, because it was almost an uncontested race, there was another person on the ballot, didn't really campaign. It's hard to tell how all those additional voters, a lot of these people were new voters who had never voted in a city election, voting for the first time. Now what they did is return the incumbents in big numbers. Again, not in a hotly contested race, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in future elections, where people who have not historically, in the history of the city, voted in city elections, all of a sudden now are voting, and that is what happened, of course. We'll see how that goes in the future.
The highest election turnout in Calabasas history, post the incorporation election, which was kind of special, was in 2015. You were on that cycle. That was 29%. So here we have more than double that, meaning there were a lot of voters who probably wouldn't have bothered with the city council races, and who knows, as you said, there's drop-off, there's just checking boxes and not knowing the names. But again, since incorporation, this was the highest turnout we've had in a midterm election, highest turnout we've had in a council race. In fact, the incorporation election had a 51% turnout, so it was even higher than that. So you're right, very high turnout. We'll see if that continues.
And if we can talk nationally just for a second.
Sure.
I mean, this turnout was driven by the President of the United States. Of course, we did not have one of the contested congressional seats here in our area, although there were some nearby. But these people were driven to the polls not only here but across the country by the president, and whether people feel positive or negative towards him, which in California is overwhelmingly negative. And as you know, across the country, the Congress, 40 seats were flipped, the largest flip since Watergate. The last time, that was 49 seats in 1974, with the president under even harsher scrutiny than the current president legally. This was a big shift.
Well, there were more Republican seats up this time than there were in the 70s. I mean, the Republicans didn't have the majority, but I agree with you. This was a blue wave. I would argue that it is not atypical of a midterm election, and it wasn't as deep of a wave as you might have had in 1994 and 2010, for example, or even 2006, because you didn't have that wave go down all the way to the state house contests around the country. Democrats flipped a lot of the governorships in the state houses, but not as many as they could have. They lost seats in the Senate. They had a difficult terrain there, but they lost some seats. And I didn't get the sense in a lot of these states that there was that much movement. California, there definitely was. This was the biggest Democratic wave I've seen in California of any year. In fact, it's the biggest wave of any type. And we'll get into that as we go to the statewide races, which we should turn to. We turn first to the governor of California, an open seat. Gavin Newsom, the Democratic lieutenant governor, versus John Cox, the Republican businessman who didn't have a lot of political experience. Republicans wanted him in a plurality, and he got the second slot in the top two primary. And I think the Republicans wanted to take a little bit of a chance to see if they could stray away from the run-of-the-mill legislator or something they put up and see how he'd do. And he got slaughtered. I mean, he lost statewide by 24 points in an open seat, lost in Calabasas and the surrounding areas by a little less. But what was your take on that?
James, this is like the punchline now. You know it's bad for the Republicans when the Republican loses for governor in Westlake Village, okay? I've never seen this before.
I don't think I've seen that.
Okay? This is a non-incumbent governor, the liberal progressive mayor, former mayor of San Francisco, and he wins in Westlake Village, okay?
And Hidden Hills.
That shows you how much, how far the Republican Party has fallen. John Cox never really gained any traction. Wasn't personally a terrible candidate, but there just was nothing there for him to really grab onto. They tried with the gas tax that we'll talk about a little later to make that an issue. Never really happened, and it would, from the top of the ticket on down, it was just a terrible showing for Republicans.
Here's what happened, and I don't disagree with you at all on this, but here's what happens. The Republicans have a poor showing. Then next time the quality of the candidate gets lower, the amount of money they are able to raise gets much lower, their profile gets lower, no one really thinks they have a chance, and the party gets demoralized. Some of these people running have no experience in government, didn't run campaigns, just made a few campaign appearances. We know one of the people who ran for Attorney General last time. He actually had less experience than us because he ran for Calabasas City Council and lost. That was his political experience. So that's the kind of candidates Republicans are running. So they're going to do worse and worse. And there's other reasons too, demographically. But going through this, the Republicans didn't even break 40% in a single statewide race. I've never seen that happen before.
One of the things that is a sad consequence of that is that you don't even get much of a campaign. Okay, you don't have to. If you're the Democratic candidate, you don't have to debate. You don't have to really get out and talk about the issues. And we saw that this time. There wasn't a robust discussion of the issues or positions because the Democrat was running so far ahead, so safe, that they played it safe, and they didn't really have to get into that. And the voters don't get to see that or analyze that or get involved in those kinds of issue discussions that you hope come out during a campaign.
One of the most fascinating races was a race for U.S. Senate because it featured incumbent Dianne Feinstein, longtime senator since 1992, against Kevin De Leon, who was in the state legislature and has been around a little less long. He's somewhat prominent in the legislature. Both Democrats. Republican didn't even make the runoff. And Feinstein, I don't think, performed very well looking at these numbers. I mean, she won by 8 percentage points. What I think happened there is a number of factors. First of all, the Democrats kind of abandoned her officially. The party didn't endorse her in the primary and actually endorsed De Leon in the general election. They felt she was too moderate and not contentious enough. And then the Kavanaugh hearings kind of happened, and De Leon ran to her left, so she was poised to do pretty well, I think, because she'd get moderates and maybe even some conservatives voting for her. And the Kavanaugh hearings, I think a lot of Republicans were turned off by her behavior. I didn't think it was that bad, quite frankly, but she did get billed as kind of a hit person during that. And if you look around the state in more conservative counties, she didn't do very well. And finally, I think she's showing her age a little bit. I saw her at the hearing. She had changed a little bit, and a lot of people who hadn't seen her in a while, I think, felt that being the oldest member of the Senate, she'll be over 90 when she completes this term, was a little much for them.
One thing I want to point out about this race, Calabasas,
Yeah.
they love Dianne
Well,
Feinstein. And if you think about it,
Yeah.
this is a sort of a perfect, I mean, she's, when you get to be 80 years old, I mean, you're getting towards the end of your career, but moderate Democrat,
Yes.
Jewish,
Yes.
experienced, and Calabasas loved her. She did 67%.
This was a big divergence.
In Calabasas, 13 points ahead of the state, 10 points ahead of the county. She's doing well here, and I think that's something that shows you what kind of a candidate people in Calabasas look for.
In the House, Ted Lieu, incumbent Democrat, easily reelected over Kenneth Wright, who was his opponent in 2014. Little closer in Calabasas, but not by much. In the state assembly, the 45th district, this was a special election earlier this year, and now this full term that Jesse Gabriel, the incumbent Democrat, beats Justin Clark again, Calabasas resident. And no surprises here, right?
No, and if you look at these numbers, both in these two races and in most of these Democrat versus Republican races on the statewide ballot, we have almost the exact same numbers in Calabasas.
Yes.
63-37. All of these races within 1 or 2 points of that number. With Feinstein running 67, she ran even a little better. Of course, she's running against another Democrat.
Yes.
But it's not quite pulling the lever for all the Democrats as you used to do in some of the states, but that's how people went down this, what was it, a 6-page ballot? In a lot of ways, it was Democrat, 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 and in Calabasas, that number was 63%.
You want to take the lieutenant governor?
Lieutenant governor was, is always an interesting race. There's at least 4 or 5% of the people in California who know that we have a lieutenant governor, but people spent a lot of money on this race, and this was Eleni Kounalakis from San Francisco, had been an ambassador under Obama. And Ed Hernandez, a state legislator who had sort of traditional Democratic Party support, and Kounalakis comes ahead 53. She had a lot more money in her campaign and did very, very well in Northern California and even with him in Southern California.
Another race with 2 Democrats.
Yeah. As we go through the other statewide offices, pretty close to my 63%. Alex Padilla at 62%, Secretary of State. Betty Yee, State Controller, 63%. State Treasurer Fiona Ma, 61% over the Republican. State Attorney General Javier Becerra, 61% in Calabasas. Interesting, the state insurance commissioner.
This was a race to watch. I said it in the primary. This race will prove, it will answer the question, is California a state where a Republican can't win or where a Democrat can't lose? Because here you have a centrist, former state insurance commissioner who had enough money to run. He had the backing of a lot of media that don't normally endorse non-Democrats. He was a prominent guy, good name recognition, and he lost. He couldn't win against a Democrat, meaning that he couldn't harness enough Republican and independent voters. I know you said that he was better off running as an independent, and he was, because he would have probably suffered closer fate to the 60-40 split over there. But here he is. He lost 53-47. In Calabasas, he would have won, which I think is a difference. And I do think that he was a good candidate for this community. And I think that this community is a little bit more elastic in its voting patterns and will consider a non-Democrat a little bit more.
And willing to look at it and be more moderate. Still going to be heavy Democrat, but like in the Dianne Feinstein vote, looking for someone maybe a little more moderate in that position. Similar in this state superintendent of public instruction race. It was a 50-50 split here. It was almost a 50-50 split in the whole state. Tony Thurmond ends up defeating Marshall Tuck.
Technically nonpartisan.
In a nonpartisan race where 20 or 30 million dollars was spent on an office that has very little specific legal power. But
let's turn to the State Board of Equalization, 3rd District, which was an open seat. It covers 1/5 of California. No big surprise here. The Democrat won. It's a Democratic majority district, a little less so in Calabasas, 58-42.
Tony Vasquez, our former mayor and councilmember from Santa Monica, is our new representative on the State Board of Equalization.
The next election probably has the biggest divergence in the entire ballot between how the county voted, or how another entity voted, a district, a county, a state, and how Calabasas voted. You have the incumbent sheriff, Jim McDonnell, falling short in his bid for re-election. Alex Villanueva, who a lot of people didn't know much about him, he beat him by about 6 percentage points countywide. In Calabasas, it was a 2-to-1 race almost, but with McDonnell getting 65% of the vote. What are your thoughts on that?
First time that an incumbent sheriff has lost re-election in over 100 years in LA County. I thought Jim McDonnell did a great job as sheriff, and this would normally be a pretty straightforward re-election. This is one where the move of this election to the state general election ballot really had a big effect, because the Democratic Party supported the opponent, the new sheriff, Sheriff Villanueva, and the union of the deputies supported him, and he made a huge push in areas of the county that have predominant Hispanic population, and that where Democratic Party was doing big turnout efforts, and McDonnell lost re-election. Here in Calabasas, were people generally happy with their sheriff's services, happy with the reforms that McDonnell had put in over the last few years.
And not a union town.
And not a union town. 65% for McDonnell.
I looked around the county. It seemed to me like it almost paralleled there was some Democrat versus non-Democrat, because McDonnell's an independent, although Alex Villanueva made a point of saying he was a Democrat. McDonnell didn't say anything because he wasn't anything. I saw a lot of racial polarization in areas with, like you said, a large Hispanic population. Villanueva did very, very well.
You had mentioned it in the Posner race. It's sort of the death of the nonpartisan in some respects, in these big money races.
Yes.
I'm not saying that's true in a city council race in the city of Calabasas, but in city of LA, city council races, which are nonpartisan, but the partisan nature of a Democratic endorsement and Democratic money and union money has a big effect. And that's now true for any of these so-called nonpartisan races in a place like Los Angeles County or statewide in the state of California.
And ethnic politics in the most diverse county in the world still plays a big role in the state, in the county, and in various cities, as we see. The county assessor's race, Jeffrey Prang winning re-election fairly easily over John Lowe. This wasn't much of a campaign. But both of these men were forced into a runoff, both the sheriff and the county assessor.
John Lowe, who changed his name officially to John Low Tax Lowe, and still couldn't win as the county assessor. So a lesson for you out there thinking of changing your name to run for office.
Proposition 1, no, I'm not going to do that. Proposition 1 was the housing assistance bonds measure. It passed by the state with a fairly decent margin, less so in Calabasas. You'll see throughout these propositions, there is an economic conservatism here that's a little more reluctant to spend money on some of these bond measures. Looking at Proposition 2, housing programs for the mentally ill, also passed by the state. The city passes a little more narrowly. These statewide propositions are all majority passage. Proposition 3, the state water supply and quality bonds. Now this is one that was interesting. The state, it narrowly got defeated, but in Calabasas it got defeated by quite a bit. Do you agree with me that we're a little more reluctant out here to spend money on taxes and bonds?
Absolutely, and there was a campaign against Prop 3 based on that and from some of the tax advocacy groups, and I think that it took hold in areas that have more concern about those tax kinds of issues. Calabasas is clearly that way as you look down the ballot. Now, of course, you get to the Children's Hospital bond, and you got Vin Scully doing the radio ads. You know, if you put children's on something or homelessness on something, those are two of the hot things right now, and you end up bumping up the percent here. Proposition 5, this was an interesting proposition put on the ballot by the realtors to try and get people to be able to move more easily. And the idea was you could take your tax basis, your low assessment with you to another county. Frankly, for Calabasas, this wouldn't have been a bad thing because we have a lot of people lived here a long time
Yes.
in big houses, and one of the reasons they're hesitant to move is they're sitting on a tax assessment of that's 1/10 of what it would be if they bought a new house in another area. And if this would have passed, it would have been easier for them to move to Palm Springs, move to other areas. We get a new owner paying property tax at the full rate, but the voters wouldn't have anything to do with it.
And it did better in Calabasas. It almost passed for that reason that you mentioned.
Prop 6, which coming into the election we thought maybe would be one of the keys to this race. This is the repeal of the gas tax. Early on polled well, looked like it might pass, looked like it might be an issue that Republicans and others could hook their wagon to.
Remember this, the state senator who had voted for it, the swing vote, and he got defeated handily in a recall.
Senator Newman.
And he was a Democrat. He got defeated by a Republican effort based on his vote. So a lot of people were thinking this would pass and that would be fairly popular.
So literally the last election, they recall a Democrat in Orange County who voted for the gas tax. And in this election, I think we're down to one elected Republican in Orange County.
Well, there's more than that.
But
not very many.
But all the Congress people.
All the congressmen are Democrats.
It's an amazing switchover in a short period of time, related not to the gas tax, but to the President of the United States. But
let me throw out one other thing. I think the wording on the ballot was not fair, frankly, and a lot of people didn't think it was fair. There was litigation over it, and the ballot measure, it said, cutting transportation funds. It didn't say repealing gas tax. It didn't talk. You had to read in between to see. You had to read detailed information to see that it was actually just repealing what the legislature had passed, and it wasn't cutting anything other than what they had passed in that. I do think that had a big effect, the wording and the title.
I agree with you. I'm not sure, and I'd give that a couple of percentage points. I'm not sure it's enough to pull it over the line in a big blue wave Democratic turnout. Daylight savings time, this was an advisory thing. You talk about the ballot. How about the fact that this election happened 2 days after we changed the clock, and all of a sudden it's getting dark at 5 o'clock? One thing people hate about changing back is that it gets dark so early. That's exactly what happened the day before the election, and sure enough, people said, no, I don't want this. Give me my sunshine back.
I spent more time on this than just about any of the proposition. It was hard to understand. But I guess now California has more flexibility, the legislature does, in changing daylight savings time.
We go into a series of what I call these business battles with either businesses versus unions or interest groups versus business groups. The first was this kidney dialysis. This was the unions working, wanting better situation in working in these dialysis centers versus the dialysis centers who spent millions and millions of dollars and convinced the voters that it was best not to regulate those industries further. We go to rent control, which has never been popular with the voters of California, interestingly. If it was ever going to catch on, maybe it would be now. We have a housing shortage. We have the homelessness crisis. The rents are high.
A lot of money was spent on this.
And going up. But even with all that, you had 60% of the entire state saying no. Calabasas, 64% no. Rent control is not something that people are looking for as an answer, even in these extraordinary times.
May I parenthetically state that Proposition 9 was yanked off by the state Supreme Court that would have would have called for the division of California into different states, like 4 different states, and of course, or 3 or 4 different states, and we, because it would not pass constitutional muster, it was taken off. It would have been interesting to see how that would have fared.
Another one of these business issues, whether the ambulance employees have to remain on call during their work breaks. This was the ambulance companies versus the unions who wanted to have their work breaks be sacrosanct and resulting in more people being hired to be ambulance drivers, and a lot of money spent, and the voters said, yes, we want people to be on call during their breaks. And then we had the animal lovers against agriculture to some extent. Agriculture didn't put up too much of a fight. I think they knew that
These never fail.
That trying to convince people that they shouldn't have more space in the cages for the animals was not going to happen.
And this,
sure
if
enough,
you
2 to
look
1.
at, was an urban-rural divide or urban-non-urban divide on the votes.
Right.
Measure W was the only county measure. This one required a 2/3 vote. It passed 69% to 31%, but again, in Calabasas, it was much more narrow, and it actually would have failed here, 59-41. It's a permanent parcel tax. They now do permanent parcel taxes instead of years, of 2.5 cents per square foot of impermeable area of real property. So it looks like we'll be paying another tax unless it gets somehow repealed.
And Calabasas, again, at a much lower percentage. Wouldn't have passed here in Calabasas. People with larger properties going to pay quite a bit of new tax. And I think people are going to be, there's going to be some brushback against this when people realize how this is going to be calculated and how this is going to work. Not that the money is not potentially going to good projects, but there's going to be a lot of feedback on this.
Well, let's wrap up, and let me just say that if I were to sum up this election, there was a blue wave. I think it's maybe a little more modest than you think it was nationwide, but in California, it's unmistakable. This was, I don't know, in my lifetime, the biggest blue wave I've ever seen. It's especially when you look at the nation, which really wasn't an earthquake. California is now sending 46 Democrats and I think 7 Republicans, depending on if there's any recounts, to the Congress. The legislature is more Democratic than it's been since the 1800s, when it was a much different state, of course. And I see Republicans losing ground everywhere. I do think it's partially or largely Trump, but this was a trend that has started years ago, and I don't see it turning around. Frankly, I mean, I know this may be a little self-serving, but I think it doesn't help the state to be a one-party state. It doesn't help the discussion of politics and good legislative answers to solutions that we're going to need, problems that we're going to need solutions to. I think that unfortunately, I don't see an end to this. I think we're going to continue to see this election after election.
What now becomes interesting in California, certainly in the legislature, is the intra-democratic party politics, the moderates versus the progressives. That's going to be what determines what comes out of our legislature and what the governor is able to do and how he plays that. That kind of fighting is going to be much more what you're going to read and hear about. And if you really want to know how things are going, that's where you're going to have to look in both houses of our state legislature, which now have greater than two-thirds majority Democrats.
Maybe Republicans will make up some of these. I think they'll win some of these seats back, but it's like an ebb and flow. They win some of the seats back, and then it goes down. Nationwide, any portends for 2020?
Well, it's going to be a very interesting election. 2020 has started. Again, the President of the United States is going to dominate almost every waking hour of our news time between now and then. It'd be very interesting to see who ends up coming from the Democratic side. Our last 3 Democratic presidents of the United States, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, 2 years out from that election, you would not have been able to name any of those. Not that they weren't governors of states and stuff, but you wouldn't pick them out of a lineup. And here we are 2 years before, and we have no idea who is going to be the Democratic opponent to, assuming Donald Trump is renominated by his party. So it's going to be a very, very interesting election, but it could very well be someone that today we have never heard of or thought of that is going to be our next president of the United States.
Well, thank you, Fred. This is one of my favorite things I do up here on the City Council, and I know it's one of yours too. One thing is for sure, regardless of what happens in 2020, we will be back with further analysis on the next CTV post-election program.